demographic change and economic life. Dr. DONEHOWER is the project director of Counting Women's Work that is part of the National Transfer Accounts Project. Her role in this project is to arrive at an estimation of the national transfer accounts profiles for men, women, girls, and boys, introducing gender as an analytical category. Dr. DONEHOWER graduated from Yale University with a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics. Later, she obtained her master's degree in statistics and philosophy in demography from the University of California, Berkeley. Currently, Dr. DONEHOWER works at the Center for Economics and Demographic of Aging in the Department of Demography at the University of California, Berkeley. Some of her areas of expertise are quantitative research methods, the interaction between population and economics, population forecasting, residential segregation, and education. Also, in 2015, Dr. DONEHOWER published a collaborative work entitled Aging and Retirement Security, United States and of America and Mexico. Dr. DONEHOWER, thank you for accepting to participate in this event. For us, it is a great honor to receive you at El Colegio de Mexico. So after this brief introduction, please join me in welcoming to Dr. Gretchen DONEHOWER.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Elvira, and thank you for the invitation. I'm sure we're all aware how lousy relations are between our two countries right now. They haven't been good for a long time, but as demographers, we can rise above all that. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy to meet you all. And so I'm going to go through the slides, but certainly as you are welcome to interrupt and ask questions throughout, and there'll be time for questions at the end, but we can also have the discussion just during the talk as well. So the concept of the gendered economy can go back in sort of demographic time as well. So in a high fertility context, women specialize in bearing and raising children. In a context where you have your first child as a woman as soon as you are sort of sexually mature, and then your whole reproductive life is spent either pregnant, nursing a newborn, having another child, raising the young children. That's an incredibly expensive investment of time, energy, and resources, and it requires most of the woman's productive capacity. So it makes sense in a high fertility context that women are going to specialize in social reproduction, in bearing and raising children. And institutions developed in all of our societies in high fertility contexts to support that specialization. We have cultural ideas and practices about marriage and work and proper gender roles. And then as time goes on, we also have legal differentiation between men and women. And certainly a lot of both of these phenomenon are not just about high fertility. I mean, as demographers, that's where we're going to be interested to understand how the demography played into all of those cultural practices and legal institutions. But of course, there are many other aspects of gender differentiation over time than just high fertility, but fertility is one that we'll be interested in specifically as demographers. So fertility decline, which also as demographers, we're all aware that every society, except for some sort of pretty much small groups within larger societies, minority groups, often maintain higher fertility, but every country's fertility is going down. Sometimes there will be slight rises, but then it sort of goes back down. But thinking over a historical period of the last half century, there's no country whose fertility is still as high today as it was 50 years ago. So all of the institutions of the gendered economy that supported those high fertility societies are no longer necessary. They can begin to change, but we also know that those institutions, those ideas, those cultural, legal institutions are sticky. They are not necessarily needed to support high fertility, but they don't just disappear overnight. So they still have ramifications on how we organize our economic lives. So just as an example of this, there's the US case. So the 3 lines on here, male labor force participation, female labor force participation go on this axis. And this is, it's not TFR, but it's just an indicator of fertility, the number of children aged 0 to 4 in the household. So, and this goes back to 1880. So this is a very long historical picture. The fertility has the discontinuity of the baby boom. You can see that big change, but the male labor force participation over this period, even in the context of this huge fertility change, is pretty much the same as it ever was, whereas female labor force participation has gone up a lot. It's now actually sort of going down, depending on sort of how you account for the age structure, but and not going down very rapidly, but a little bit. But so where you go from a context of always pretty much having young children in a household to having young children in a household in a much more compressed period of the household sort of life course. Women's labor force participation has also risen steadily during this time. And then this is from Our World in Data. That's the data source for this slide. If any of you have not seen this, it's a great website. It's just a wonderful resource. You can, if you don't like wasting time on the internet, this is a way to spend time on the internet, but it's very good time. So it's good procrastination. You can say it's productive procrastination. Because, so in all of these countries, and Mexico is the blue line, or I guess it looks more purple to you guys down here, but so it's a pretty steady change. It's going up everywhere. In the United States here, you can see the decline in the most recent period. That's has some age structure effect in it, but this has been a long-term historical change. So certainly the long-term historical change of lowered fertility has gone with the long-term historical change of rising female labor force participation. So this is also from Our World in Data. It looks sort of terrible, but it also goes with this cool visualization. So you can go, and I think they just published this new article on female labor force participation. So this is an XY plot. And each line is 2 time points. So, of course, the arrows are sort of too tiny to see. But so here's Uganda at the beginning of this period, which is 1960. And then the arrow goes up to 2015. Here is where fertility and labor force participation were in 1960. And here is where they are in 2015. And so I know this is a mess, but go check it out on your own sometime because it's pretty cool. And then also, you know, they do that cool tableau thing where you can just sort of highlight one particular arrow at a time to figure out particular countries. But you can generally see this sort of sweep of the historical experience across these countries of lowering fertility and rising female labor force participation. Of course, India is a notable exception here. And there's a big debate on this sort of U-shaped relationship between fertility and female labor force participation, or sorry, between development and incomes and female labor force participation. That at a period of great poverty, everyone's working because all of everyone's productive capacity is needed as much as possible. Then countries get a little richer and they're able to realize, and of course here is where the debate is, preferences, but whose preferences? Preferences for a mother being able to be at home with her children and take care of the household and not have to work so much. And then theoretically, and in some places we have seen this, incomes rise enough that then, and fertility falls, then women can increase their education, their human capital, and also their labor force participation. But, so the general picture is that lower fertility, higher female labor force participation, but also, I like this graph because it shows the real diversity across countries in the experience of this phenomenon. So I think one of the important things to understand about the gendered economy is that so far I've been talking about one kind of work. I've been talking about market work and market labor. And our economic monitoring tools developed in a context of defining work as market labor only. So this 2x2 table shows how national accounts, system of national accounts defines the production boundary of what is considered economic activity, what is considered an economic good to consume. And so there's goods and services in the column, and then whether they are sold in the marketplace or produced and consumed in the household. And so this 2x2 table shows you what's included in GDP. So anything, a good or service that's sold in the marketplace, is already included in this production boundary. And then for items that are produced and consumed in the household. So when a household grows food for its own use, makes products for its own use, or think of the services of capital, like if you own your home, there's a flow of services you are realizing you're able to consume from that owned home, that you don't have to pay rent for it every month, but you still get to consume it. So that's not a market good, but it is a good imputed in national accounts. So if it's a good, if it's something your house is providing you, or if it's food you're making and consuming for yourself, the national accountants impute the value of that into GDP. So it's, however, if it's a service produced and consumed in your household, that's not included in GDP. So this is Indira Herway, I think, made this distinction in an article, or she's an Indian sociologist and researcher, and made this distinction about, think of a household that grows a potato, and the potato grows in the ground. The amount of fertilizer and work that the family spent to grow the potato, even though they weren't getting paid for it in cash, is imputed into national accounts. That potato is harvested and brought into the house, and at the door of the household, the accounting of that value ends. So somebody takes that potato into the household, they clean it, they cook it, they serve it, they clean up after the meal, and all of those services from the time it goes inside the household is treated as invisible, whereas before it hits the household, it's visible. So this is sort of this traditional gendered segregation of economic activity, with men working outside of the household and women working inside the household, maps exactly onto what our economic measurement architecture considers to be the economy. And it's pretty fascinating because you can go back and read the history of the development of national accounts. And they did discuss this, like Simon Kuznets and all of his guys who sort of developed a lot of the national accounting architecture, talked about how cleaning, and services inside the household wouldn't be counted. And they said, well, those things are very hard. How are we going to measure them? And so, which I get, but I think it's also equally hard to impute a value to, say, subsistence agriculture, but that didn't stop them from figuring out a way to do it and try. So I can only think that there is some aspect of a gender blind spot in this, that all the people who developed this architecture were men, and it just wasn't very salient to them what went on in their households. That was somewhat invisible to them. And so that sort of social organization worked its way into our understanding of economics still today. So if we think about household services as women's work, and of course everybody does these things. I mean, we all make our own peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever in the middle of the night, and even in this household services thing, there's sort of a sexual division of labor. When I was growing up, my dad took care of the outside. He mowed the lawn. He fixed the cars, while my mom and my sisters and I, outside, fixed the cars, mowed the lawn with my brother, and my mom and my sister and I did the laundry, cleaned inside. So those were all unpaid household services, and my male relatives were doing those things as well, but there was still a sort of sexual division of labor to those things, and we see that in our data as well. But so acknowledging that both men and women do this work, I'm still going to call it women's work, but why count women's work? So to recognize social reproduction and care as economic activity. So household services, the bearing and raising of children, is an economically productive activity. It maintains the labor force, it makes workers able to go to work, and it gives the economy a future. If somebody isn't bearing and raising children, there is no future for the economy. So, and certainly in many countries now who are facing potential economic or social problems from very low fertility, below replacement fertility, and the phenomenon of population decline, those countries are really having to reckon with the value of social reproduction and why it doesn't seem valuable enough that people are doing it on their own. So that's one long-term reason to begin to understand this piece that is outside of our regular economic accounting. The other reason that we stress in the project is that policy development and analysis requires data and measurement. Excuse me. So Elvira mentioned, and I think some of you also, well, some of you in this room are very familiar with the National Transfer Accounts Project. So the National Transfer Accounts Project takes the things that are included in that 2x2 table already, and those things that in national accounts we get for each country at a particular point in time, and tries to pull apart those national numbers by age so that we know how much each age group in an economy produces, consumes, saves, transfers to one another at any given time. And so that, the NTA project refers to that as the generational economy. And that is becoming more and more important for our policymakers to understand, because as fertility declines, we demographers know, all of our populations are aging. This, I want to make my t-shirt say, aging, everyone's doing it. Yes. Little joke, demography joke. Better than the other single demography joke I know, you guys have probably all heard it. How do you tell a demographer? They're broken down by age and sex. Come on, you guys haven't heard that before? Maybe it doesn't translate into Spanish as well, but yeah, so you're welcome. There's your demography joke for the day. But so national transfer accounts showed that taking these one numbers and revealing the previously sort of invisible age dimension of the economy was going to be useful for lots of policy reasons. And we want to add gender to that framework because our economic lives are gendered. We know that we are specializing in different areas. So that has two pieces. We want to add gender to the national transfer accounts piece, but we also want to add this invisible part of women's work to that. Because then we can, like NTA has done with the phenomenon of population aging, we can give data and evidence to people who are trying to understand the gender revolution in their own economies. Either what has happened in the past or what they hope is going to happen in the future to achieve different ends like development, like raising incomes, like investing in human capital. So women spend more time on unpaid care work. Men do more market work. This is the example in the United States. Now, both of these graphs are just time. This is hours per week on the y-axis, and age on the x-axis for both of these. So the yellow piece is market goods and services, how much time people spend in market jobs. And then the blue piece is unpaid care work. So females on the left, males on the right. And when I say unpaid care work, this combines both direct care for children, elders, and the community, so volunteering, sort of community care, and activities that we would consider child care, where you are directly sort of interacting with your child or directly supervising their time. But it also includes the time spent in maintaining households, which is also part of reproduction, which is also part of maintaining the labor force on the market side. So that's all of the cooking and cleaning and household management and maintenance and managing finances and all those things that it takes to run a household and keep it going. And this isn't just the time spent for, say, mothers with children, it's everybody in the society. So people who live by themselves are doing these activities also, but they're just doing them for themselves. So you see that both men and women in the United States are doing unpaid care work. Women are doing more, and the same thing for market work. Both genders are doing quite a bit of it, but men are doing more than women. So the degrees of economic gender segregation in these types of work vary across countries. So there's Ghana on the top. Men are doing very little unpaid care work in Ghana. Women are much more balanced, and they're actually doing more market work in terms of average time at most ages than unpaid care work, but they're certainly doing more unpaid care work than men. And my colleague Estela Riero, who is on the Mexican National Transfer Accounts team and does the estimates of time use in Mexico, was kind enough to share with me the results from the 2014 Mexico Time Use Survey. So there's plenty of gender segregation in work in Mexico as well. So, and also it looks like if you are a 35-year-old woman in Mexico, you get to feel very bad for yourself because you are doing more work than anyone. Just in terms of the total amount of time, that's a lot of time. And I should stress that these are per capita, these are age averages. So there's great diversity in each of these numbers. This is just a mean for each age group. So now, is this specialization a problem? If girls and women's unpaid care work time is a barrier to them participating in paid work or getting an education or access to time for leisure, rest, and self-care, then yes, it is. If it's a trade-off of sort of 1 hour for 1 hour, that's fine. But what we see in the data is that actually the more specialization, the greater the total work difference that the more work women are doing compared to men. So as we increase our labor force participation, our market work over time, we're not decreasing our unpaid care work responsibilities at the same rate. So we end up spending more time. And there's a growing recognition of the need to understand time poverty. So, and this is a gender issue. It's also a class issue, that new ways of structuring work that prevent people from using their time on leisure, rest, or self-care, which maintains their health, maintains their quality of life over time. So women specialize in the invisible sector. So specialization seems to be a problem because it means time disadvantage, it means barriers to other opportunities, but as we were talking before, the fact that this invisible sector is outside of traditional economic monitoring and policy analysis. And when you go into Econ 101, maybe you studied something about sort of gains to marriage or something, or in an economic demography class, you might study the economics of fertility, and that there's some time burden involved in there. But in most economic training, most public policy training, unpaid care work is not really in there. The data has not been available. It hasn't been integrated the way that market data has. And so women are specializing in this invisible sector. So even if the trade-off was 100% fair, there would still be a disadvantage in terms of women's economic contribution and activities not being included in recognizing economic value and when we want to understand the policy implications of a particular kind of change. So this creates policy and monitoring blind spots, and I'll mention a few of those as we go on. So the National Transfer Accounts Project, as it went on, wanted to add gender into the framework to disaggregate national accounts by age and also by gender, and to add unpaid care work in this. And when we started this, the first project in the network was Counting Women's Work, measuring the gendered economy. And there's our cool logo, which is the lady in one of those sand, why am I forgetting the name for it now? Sand clock, yeah. There's like a sand timer, hourglass, thank you. Okay, hourglass. But of course, as I said before, what's in the hourglass is not just work done by women. Men are doing this too. Girls and boys are doing this work as well. So in that project, we worked across all of the country teams in the national transfer accounts, which are now up to 60 around the world, and developed the methodology together so that it went with the NTA methodology and that we could apply it across a broad range of countries. And so in an international research project, you have two issues. You want to coordinate the concepts that are of interest to everyone. You want to try to be measuring the same thing. And then when you figure out how you're going to do that, you have to deal with the fact that every country's data is different in terms of availability, in terms of the degree of detail that you can get from national accounting sources, from survey sources, how frequently the surveys that we require are done. So that for a big international cross-country comparative research project like NTA, that's what we're always working with. And so that same mindset was applied to Counting Women's Work. So our first two funders were International Development Research Center of Canada and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation of the US. So our first group of countries were kind of 4 countries in Africa, Asia, a group in the Americas, and then the European project had a big European Commission funded project to do 22 European countries. So we have a few more that have come online since then with the time use accounts and gender accounts, but we're getting up to the point where we can do some good cross-country analyses on Counting Women's Work, just like we did in the initial NTA market work. So, and this is a picture, Estelle has seen this a million times, that I've shown a long time. So Counting Women's Work's goal is to value everyone's work and measure everyone's care. So I've been focusing a lot on the fact that Counting Women's Work is about measuring the production in the unpaid care work economy, but we're also very interested in the consumption of that work, because NTA's basic first purpose was to understand transfers, how resources go from groups that are producing, age groups that are producing, to age groups that are consuming. So that the consumers, mainly children and the elderly, although in some countries the elderly are making net transfers down to younger groups until the oldest old ages. But so trying to understand that economic dependency, and of course we know that unpaid care work is going to be a big part of that economic dependency. So not just on the production side, we want to understand the invisible economy, the unpaid care work economy, but on the consumption side as well, so we can understand that aspect of economic dependency. So there's my husband. He makes beer. He is at his job producing market goods in a brewery. And there he is at our house producing non-market services. And this is how long I've been working on this, because that kid is now 10 years old. So can't put him in the little baby carrier anymore. But yeah, so I like this picture because I don't have to pay him to use it. And also because then it reminds me, if I haven't so far, to say, oh yeah, men do this stuff too. So, okay, so the approach of the national transfer accounts, if anyone's not familiar with this, I've sort of touched on it before, but so we start with the national accounting framework. Now, any of you, as demographers, we probably don't get into national accounts very much, except to sort of use GDP as, one explanatory variable or something. But the global architecture for understanding the concepts that go into national accounting, measuring them, maintaining the framework, adjusting it as our economies change, is a long time existing institution that many of our economies rely on for their monitoring purposes. And so we wanted to plug into that existing framework and disaggregate that by age. So we take national accounts as sort of we call them macro controls, our aggregate controls. We're always going to match to totals from national accounts. And then the way that we get the age dimension of those national accounts is to use household surveys. Every country has surveys, household surveys that are monitoring their labor force and also providing data on the cost of consumption, oftentimes to figure out sort of consumer prices and what's happening in inflation in your economies. And so we use those household surveys and get the information both on the demography in our households and then on flows into and out of our households to figure out how much people are producing and consuming, and then how people are transferring to each other, both within the household and across households. And administrative data by administrative data, I mean data that our government collects and sort of processes into some kind of aggregate flows, often with age detail. And so for the government programs that are the mode for a lot of the public transfers, because in NTA, we don't just look at private transfers, say, from myself to my children, but we also want to understand transfers that are mediated through the public sector. So that is taxes paid for by people in working, also people paid for by corporations, paid for by any entities in our economy, and then those taxes are used to pay for services that go out to citizens, to people in our populations. So transfer programs like pensions, the provision of publicly funded health care, education is the big one that goes to children through the public sector. And so we use data from government sources to track all of those flows by age. So taking national accounts, disaggregating them by age, reveals the generational economy, the systems of intergenerational transfers and support that sustain us. And those institutions, those systems vary a lot from country to country. The European countries have very well-established, very large compared to the size of their economies, welfare states. They're taking a lot in taxes, they're paying a lot in benefits. Then there are countries with a very small public sector. Mexico is sort of in the middle of that process. They're increasing coverage for people for public transfer programs on health, pensions, and other aspects of that. And then There are countries like the US that have a big public sector, but we have compared to European countries, not so generous transfer systems for pensions and healthcare. So, and now for the gendered aspect of that, we extend this approach to include separate estimates by sex. So when you're looking at the market economy, the gender dimension of the market economy, that has aspects. One, we already kind of discussed, labor force participation, that men and women are going to have very different labor income. But they're also going to benefit and pay into the public sector at different rates. So they're going to pay different taxes based on their earnings, and they're going to receive different programs. If there's a health program, women at certain ages are going to require more different kinds of health care, childbearing ages. At old age, the oldest age groups are the most expensive for healthcare provision, and those also are the most female. So there are different ways that there's a gendered aspect of a market transfer system too. And then on top of the gendered aspect of the market system, we want to add the national time transfer accounts. So the national time transfer accounts are adding the unpaid care work piece. We start off with time use surveys and identify unpaid care work activities in time use surveys. That is defined by a long-standing, and this is a long-standing research project, or rather research methodology, to add unpaid care work to national accounting. So this is not a methodology that NTA just thought up by itself. For decades, people have been working to use time use surveys to identify unpaid care work using the third-person criterion. So can you pay someone else to do it for you? So I could pay someone else to take care of my children. I could pay someone else to clean my house, to cook meals for my kids, or I can take them out to restaurants. I can't pay anyone to go to school for me, so education is not going to be in this unpaid care work. That's more of a time investment. It's like the investment analog in unpaid care work, sort of, or in the non-market world, that investment in physical capital would be in the market side. And things like brushing your teeth and sleeping. I mean, I suppose you could pay someone to brush your teeth for you, but gross. You couldn't really do anything else while they were doing it. So, and sleeping, you couldn't pay someone else to sleep and still get the benefit of it. So that's how the third-party person criterion works. So once I know how much time everyone is spending on this unpaid care work, then I have to figure out an appropriate market wage, because I want to end up with monetary valued accounts so they can go together with the national transfer accounts, which are in money units. So this is a very contentious part of the methodology. So you can imagine there are many ways to value this time. On the market side, you don't really have to worry about the valuation because somebody paid for it and gave their estimate of the final value of that product or service. But so there are several ways that you can figure out what an appropriate imputed wage for this unpaid care work is. One of them is the opportunity cost method. So if I spend an hour taking care of my kid instead of doing demography, then you could value that hour taking care of my kid at my demographer wage. Or you could say that I'm going to use a replacement method to value that time. So the value that I produced is the value of what I would have to pay someone else to do that service for me. And that would be the prevailing child care worker wage. So what we decided in NTA, because it is an accounting exercise and not an exercise on sort of understanding why people decided to do an activity themselves versus purchase it in the market. So there you want to understand more about the decision nature, the incentives for deciding one way or the other, so their opportunity cost would be more important. But in the accounting framework that NTA is, we decided that the replacement wage is more appropriate. And I think that this is a good choice for the housework aspect of unpaid care work, When I do laundry, because I have a PhD, it's no more valuable. The laundry is not done any better than if I paid someone who was working in a laundromat to do it for me who didn't have the education that I have. So I don't think in an accounting framework there's any reason to value an hour spent doing laundry at an opportunity cost wage. Now, the child care aspect is very different because there's all sorts of research showing that the more education the parents have, the more actual input the child receives, the more words they have heard by the time they're 3 or 4, the more time they spend reading with parents, that those inputs do have a difference by sort of the human capital of the person providing it. Now, as I said, in NTA, we made the decision to use the opportunity cost method because, while I think there's a compelling argument for valuing direct care, not on the replacement method, there's really no way that we've been able to figure that was workable for us to decide how to do that. In opportunity cost itself is maybe too high, and then if we're not going to do that, what's the other alternative? I don't know. So it's all replacement method. And then the last little tag on here is reminding myself to tell you that we're also then imputing the consumption. So as I said, the national time transfer accounts for NTA are not just about understanding work, production. They're also about understanding consumption and dependency. So once I know how much unpaid care work is being produced in a household, and I also know who lives in that household by age, then I can impute the consumption of that time. So I have a network within the household of time produced on various activities and who is consuming that time. So the advantages of the NTA and National Time Transfer Account approach, first compared to just national accounting or compared to other ways that I've seen these kinds of things done in the literature, I think is that NTA includes the age dimension. And of course, as demographers, we all understand that age is one of the most salient facts about life, about our economic lives, about our social lives. If you were thinking about someone and having a theory about their economic life in some way or their social lives, the first thing you would want to know is if that person is 1 or 91, because that's a very different situation, or even more different, say 1 and 50, in terms of what role they're going to play in the economy and what they are able to contribute, what they require to consume. So including the age dimension is important because it makes the estimates more useful for policy. I skipped over my other bullet, but also that life cycle processes drive the financial and unpaid care work dynamics, especially in the time transfer account. So the work within the household is work to bear and raise children. It's work to care for elders. And that changes as a life cycle process. So as you leave a parental household, make your own household, enter a workforce, enter childbearing ages, and then your parents grow old and you grow old yourself. So life cycle processes are determining the demand for care and how much has to be provided by whom. So to have the age dimension of that makes them much more useful and informative. So, I mean, I'm sure that when time use surveys come out, there are a lot of reports in the press that say sort of men do this and women do that, and you get some difference by hour. But if the men and women in that are sort of an average across, say, 20 to 60, that's not very informative for a lot of what drives the sort of gendered economy within households. It's very different if you're talking about a couple who's, say, 30 and 35 or something compared to 60. So, and national time transfer accounts were designed to fit with the NTA framework. So we can estimate consumption of unpaid care work time in the same way as we estimate the consumption of market goods and services. And then those go together naturally. And so we can take concepts that NTA developed, not that NTA is the only one who did this, but demographic dividends, I'm sure you've all heard about. The analysis of demographic dividends with national transfer accounts, age profiles of economic life, can then be extended very easily to include unpaid care work. So to understand demographic dividends that don't just come from change in age structure affecting markets, but also affect households and household life. Okay, so here's an example of what we end up with for Mexico after we do all this stuff. So I think you can probably all still hear me, but so on this side is the national transfer accounts age profiles. So I have one consumption profile. We can separate these things out by gender, but the methodology to do so is not, it only picks up some kinds of gender differentiation, only picks up gender differentiation that is observable between households, not within households. So, and to apply the methodology inside households, it makes it much harder to do it consistently across all of our NTA countries. So we have not really emphasized that yet. But you can see clearly the difference in the labor income. So those differences, the way NTA has its labor income curve is its average labor income at each age. So that includes differences in labor force participation and hours worked for those in the labor force, and then wages, so occupational segregation, differential wages for same work. All of those potential differences are included in the difference between these two curves. And the one thing also to note, and this is true for many countries, is that this average consumption curve is always higher for women than men. So to support, on average, their market consumption, women require transfers from men. Now, on the national time transfer account side, we see a very different pattern. So women are producing much more of this work than men are. That's the solid bar down there. And the consumption curve itself, oh, sorry. That's okay, no problem. Let's see, okay. You can probably hear me anyway, but yeah. And so on the unpaid care work side from national time transfer accounts, every male requires a transfer of time on average from a female person. Now, the scale of this part of the economy, now we saw before on just the time side, let's see how fast I can get there. Yeah, okay. So just when we were looking at the Mexican economy, and this is from 2014, in time units, women were producing a lot more. They were spending a lot more time at work. So then why, when we go and apply these wages, does this get squashed down so much? Well, that's because wages paid for unpaid care work are very low. So there are a lot of reasons for this. One is that a lot of those activities are very low productivity activities. Cleaning a house is generally going to be producing less value than making semiconductors or something like that. Although you could argue that, I guess. You don't have to live in a semiconductor all the time. There's also the aspect of these wage differentiations that is just a history of gender discrimination. So these have been considered women's work, so they're sort of poorly paid. And then there's just kind of the mechanical aspect of the fact that if you want to do these activities that women traditionally specialize in for no pay, if you want to do them in the market, you're competing against a shadow workforce that earns zero. So the market wage for these activities is always going to be low. So we want to make the invisible economy visible, but we can't fix that. So we emphasize that the time units give us important information about economic activity. The monetary units give us information too, but they don't necessarily tell us about sort of value, how much value childcare is. Certainly when you think about if you didn't do it, you would have no future. There, obviously, the price that we pay childcare workers is quite undervalued. But that is just to say why this is way down here and that is way up there. However, we do see, at least this corrects the perception that women are just sort of a dead weight loss, you know, that we're a consumption good. I agree that we are very fun to have around, but we are certainly not unproductive. So here, women are making all of these transfers to men and to children. Okay, so when we put these two things together, what we see is an economy by gender that looks much more equal than if this is all we see. We also see a cost of dependency for children if we're including the cost of their care that is much higher than if we were only looking at their market goods and services. We also see production by older people and therefore a sort of deficit by older people, a production that's larger and a deficit that's smaller than if we're only considering market goods and services. So here's the same thing for the US. So again, now women in the US have a short sort of period in this cross-sectional data where they're actually making more in labor income than they're consuming, but it's pretty small. But we have the same pattern where women are making a lot more of a contribution to unpaid care work than men, and we have this same pattern here that actually, in terms of unpaid care work, babies and young children are consuming more of this unpaid care work than they are in market goods and services. I think that's the same for Mexico, let's see. Yeah, so this point is at almost 0.5, and it's distinctly below 0.5 over here. So if we're leaving this piece out of our understanding of the costs of children, we've really made a big mistake. We've really underestimated that. Here's for India. So unfortunately, their national time use survey has not been repeated since 1999, but I think at least it is also useful here to see that this is the most extreme example of separation of the spheres. It's not as much like this in India anymore, but it's a very complex story, but at least at this time, you know, this was just a very stark contrast of very heavily segregated economic life. However, when you look at the total economy, it looks much more equal than just the market economy or just the household economy. Vietnam, so this is Vietnam's first time use survey, 2015, and it was a small survey, pilot, so we definitely need to do this survey again on a larger scale and kind of reconfirm this. But I show it because there's potentially, if it turns out that we can validate it with another survey, a very interesting pattern of unpaid care work here. That in the peak working ages, Vietnamese men and women are both doing a lot of market labor. And who is sort of filling in the care gap? It's sort of the younger people in the households and the older people in the household. So this sort of dip was kind of interesting. Okay, so what do we see? A great deal of specialization by gender in economic participation, but very variable across countries. Unpaid care work is a huge part of the economy, but largely invisible. And then what I was saying, young children consume more in time than in market goods and services, and age patterns appear very different if we consider the total economy. So let's see how long I've been blabbing. Okay, so across, looking more comparatively across different countries. So this is unpaid care work as a proportion of all work in terms of time or money. So think of those curves I showed you, and if I integrate them over population, so weight them by population and add them up, and then compare the different kinds of work. So you can see that unpaid care work in blue as a proportion of total work time for several countries in this graph, and they're sort of sorted by per capita income, is above 50%. So more than half of all the work time being spent is being spent on unpaid care work. Now in orange, that's that same calculation, but when I weight the different unpaid care work activities by replacement wage or use the regular NTA market monetary valued labor income. profiles. So there, as we saw with the Mexico case and all the other cases, things get squished down because the wages for unpaid care work are generally lower than average market wages. But we still see that there's a really substantial amount of value being produced. Okay, so unpaid care work relative to GDP. So this is sort of going from our age specificity to kind of lumping things back together as an aggregate, but this is traditionally what people who want to integrate household production accounts into national accounting have been pointing out, that even with low replacement wages, low for unpaid care work, when I value this time by a market wage, it is a substantial part of the economy. So in these countries, the range is about, I think Ghana was about 12% because the wage for unpaid care work is very low. And then the highest are Germany and Italy, over 50% of GDP. And those are so high because they have very high minimum wages. And they have very little of the informal economy. So even the typically low-paid, unpaid care worker, household service workers are paid a pretty decent wage. Women specialize in unpaid care work and spend more time in total work, so this is just a different way to look at those differences. So this is for ages 30 to 50, and I've taken out any kind of age differentiation within that 20-year window so that there's no age structure effect here. If the bar is above 0, that means men specialize in it. If it's below 0, women. So the green bars, market work, when men are doing on average 10 to 35 more hours per week than women in market work. Below that, you can see the trade-off. Women are specializing in unpaid care work. That's the blue bars. The darker blue bars, or purple, are total work. So if you add those together. Note that all of them are below 0. So women are doing more total work in all of these countries. Okay, so is this unpaid care work a problem? And so down below, there are those same graphs. If the bar is above, that means males are specializing in it. If it's below, then females. So for girls, if it's crowding out their time to education, that would be a problem. So there's evidence in some places that girls are getting actually more time on education than boys, but the lower income countries, that reverses. And that's mostly because girls are sort of not going on to tertiary education. We've done a great job as a globe at equalizing education gender gaps for primary, less so at secondary, but still improving. But tertiary education is where we really need to make more gains. But still, even at age 16, the blue bars are showing you how much unpaid care work girls are specializing in different countries. And so this is sort of a fascinating thing to me, and most of our national time use surveys just go down to either age 15, some of them go down to 10, but specialized surveys of young people show that as low in the age range as you can measure this, girls are specializing in unpaid care work. So I think it's called Young Lives, a study that's in Vietnam, and I'm blanking on the other countries, but so even as young as 5 and 6, young girls are taking care of young brothers and sisters. They're doing household chores. Now their brothers, boys, are working too, but they're working in the household farm. They're working in the household-owned shop. They're doing agricultural work. So certainly the fact that that work can crowd out education is a problem for both boys and girls. But the fact that it's shaping human capital as young as that for future trajectories is also a particular problem for girls, because boys potentially are going to be able to earn higher wages on the things that they're learning to do younger, whereas girls are already sort of being slotted into a trajectory of unpaid care work that could then perhaps keep them away from other opportunities as they get older. Now for women, the amount of time, the additional time they're spending on this unpaid care work, is that a barrier to market work? There's also an aspect of this that it's a barrier to a job search, that if you have to bring your kid with you all the time, you have to find a job that will allow you to have your kid with you, and say you have to find a job that's close to your house. You can't be that far away if there's an emergency, if you're gonna need to call on your neighbors or other family members. So your job search is bounded by your unpaid care work responsibilities. And any search process that has a narrower boundary than another one is going to, on average, come out with a worse outcome. And then there's the issue of time poverty, looking at the sort of remainder time, leisure, and self-care that's not spent on work and education. In all of these countries, men have more access to that than women. Now, those differences are not huge. I mean, well, yeah, 2 hours per day, that's pretty huge. They're not huge, but yeah, that's pretty big. Okay, so now just going back to gender and market work for a minute. So these are the ratio of labor income curves. So those labor income curves that I showed where women are generally lower than men. So if they were equal, they would be at this one line, but generally they're below the one line. And also generally they tend to be closer to it for younger people and to kind of decline with time. There's also what I see, and that decline with time is going to be a cohort effect, that when these women entered the labor force, they were at a much greater disadvantage compared to their male cohorts in terms of their education and human capital than these cohorts entering the labor force. We've done a good job at equalizing some of these inputs. So that flows through into equalizing some of the wage patterns that we see. It's also the fact of childcare, that at age 20, this sort of unpaid care work burden is going to be less, but many of these women are dropping out of the labor force as they begin to have more kids, or reducing time as those household burdens increase. But the other thing about this is that there's a great deal of diversity in these curves, which then again indicates that there's also prospect for change. Okay, so I think I said all that. Policy relevance, so gender equity, I've been sort of discussing those as we go on. Are boys and girls getting equal human capital investments, getting equal opportunities for work and leisure? And then I think there's some really interesting new research on the gender wage gap that shows that it is, and this has mainly been in richer countries, so things like the effect on Uber drivers in the United States, and wages in Denmark, but it's showing that these wage gaps are parenthood gaps, that it's not necessarily a gender gap. If it was, you would see women who don't have children having these gaps as well, and that's not what we see. So it's a parenthood gap, but it's falling on mothers. So I think this sort of gives us sort of two policy questions. Why is parenthood so expensive? And depending on the answer to that, well, maybe we should be subsidizing it a lot more. And then there's the second question, well, okay, if it's expensive, why is it always the mothers who end up paying that? And how can we move the needle on that as well? Then there's an efficiency question. So are housework and care responsibilities a barrier to market work? And that has efficiency implications in when you think about all of the human capital investments we have made to equalize girls' health and education inputs. And then if we are getting them to their ages where they would enter the labor force and circumscribing their opportunities by the need to do unpaid care work or by gender roles, then we are basically being inefficient with those investments. We haven't allowed those girls themselves to realize all of the opportunities or all of the returns from that human capital investment that they could have, and thus our societies are also potentially losing out. Now, this is not to say that it's not a valuable investment to then take your human capital and turn it into the human capital of your children. Not to say that it is an inefficient activity to raise a family, but if you are not able to deploy your human capital in the way that you have the greatest comparative advantage, then we know from Econ 101 that there's dead weight loss in that transition. So then there's the issue that some of these activities are very low productivity activities, gathering wood, gathering water, and many sub-Saharan African countries and Asian countries, something women spend a lot of time on. And it's really inefficient work. It's very low productivity work. And so can we invest in physical infrastructure to reduce the amount of time that those activities take? Can we have piped water? Can we have more rural electrification? A lot of these gains have already been realized in many places, but there's still some to go. Transportation is another one that in a lot of unpaid care work, you're moving children or people from one place to another, and can we improve transportation systems so that those activities don't take so long? And then there's inclusiveness. Do we make incorrect policy when we only measure some work and only measure some consumption? So this is the issue of the invisible part of the economy. Okay, and unpaid care work invisibility leads to policy blind spots. So human capital investment, as I was just talking about that, so returns can be lower if girls are sort of engineered into unpaid care work instead of kind of able to go towards activities where they have the most talent and the most ability. I think child marriage is often discussed only as kind of a human rights issue, but I think that there is another constituency to be had on the issue of child marriage if you also consider it as child labor. So child labor is often focusing on sort of boys going to factories or boys having to have their education crowded out by the need to work on a family farm. But when a girl is married off, basically to do household labor for someone else, there's the exact same dynamic is happening there as with boys doing market labor. So infrastructure investment, I was just talking about how infrastructure investment can increase the productivity of some unpaid care work. However, if the finance department is costing out a rural electrification program or investments into public transportation, they're doing the cost-benefit analysis, and if the only benefits are that I'm gonna get people to their market jobs faster, then maybe the answer of that cost-benefit analysis comes out too low. If you're not thinking about all the other potential benefits in making unpaid care work more efficient, then you might not invest to the degree that you would otherwise. And then you've missed an opportunity to increase your productivity and made a worse investment than you would have. There's a lot of, I think, research to do in demographic dividend analysis, including unpaid care work. So demographic dividend analysis, probably you're all heard about it, but it is about understanding how age structure changes make economic opportunities. So that is pretty much only confined in the discussions of realizing the demographic dividend, how big it's gonna be, what policies are needed to achieve it, very much focused on market work only. How are we going to create jobs for, say, youth bulge generations? How are we going to invest in human capital so that when that youth bulge hits the market, they are best able to realize a demographic dividend? But there's also the fact that as population age structures change, you're going to free up a lot of time in unpaid care work. We saw how expensive children are in terms of time. So then, and I think I have another slide about that. Okay, so here's an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is a projected support ratio for Mexico. So taking Mexico's consumption age profile, just market consumption, and labor income, just market labor income, weighting it by population and taking the ratio of that. So the ratio tells you how much labor income, or how much your consumption is going to be able to be supported by your labor income. And you add that with population projections over time, and that tells you how much that ratio is going to change only due to changing population age structures. So it's sort of a scenario-based analysis because we know that the actual shape and level of those curves is going to change too. But at least it allows us to get a specific number about if our economies are still organized in 50 years the way they are today, it's going to be harder or easier for us to consume the way we do today. So what we see is that Mexico is going to be, the support ratio is increasing up until about 2030, so you're still year over year easier as long as labor income is stable. It doesn't have to grow. This is not even assuming that you're sort of increasing labor force participation at every age, but we keep that curve stable. As long as we're able to do that, then just our changing age structure will make it easier to consume. Okay, 2030, the good times end. Mexico is aging more in that period. The population pyramid is getting more column-shaped instead of pyramid-shaped, and then that ratio goes down. And then by 2100, who knows what's going to happen in 2100, but you know, in this scenario, then we are significantly lower than we were now. Okay. If instead of just using the market curves, I also add those unpaid care work curves that you saw. So now I have consumption of market goods and services and time compared to the labor income of producing market goods and services, but also producing unpaid care work, the picture is quite different. And why is that? That's because kids are expensive. Kids are more expensive in terms of unpaid care work than in market goods and services, and old people are more productive in terms of unpaid care work than in market work. So it's sort of the problems of population aging are mitigated somewhat when we think about the potential for free time. So the partial picture, dependency is just due to need for market goods and services. The complete picture, dependency also includes the need for care. Now, if in our aging future, we all have dementia and require constant care, that picture will change a lot. But there are also a lot of reasons to think that won't be what happens. The projected elder care is a very fruitful, active area of research right now, and it's quite fascinating. I'm trying to work on some stuff there for the US. But okay, so what does this mean, thinking about these demographic dividends in different ways? So the traditional demographic dividend analysis is about free money. So you get your population age structure gives you an opportunity. And you can either just consume that extra funds temporarily, you can have a party, and then it's gone, and then you have to pay the price. Or you can take that excess productive capacity and actually invest it and hope to move your whole economy onto a higher growth path. And that's sort of the Asian tiger story that in many of these countries that experienced rapid growth, that along with the increasing total production of their economies invested a lot of that production. Now, of course, they also experienced their dividend phases at a time when the global supply of capital and global economic growth was much more favorable than it seems like it's going to be going forward. So that particular aspect of the party is over. You know, it's not going, the Asian tiger story is unlikely to happen again. That doesn't mean that the demographic dividend isn't still a strong opportunity to actually realize some real enhanced economic growth over time. So the augmented demographic dividend, adding unpaid care work into it, is about free time. So what is the time going to go to? So this is where the sort of policy questions and the scenarios get very interesting to me. So it could be perhaps that households, women and mothers and fathers, are going to spend the same amount of time, total time, on their kids when they have one or two of them as they did when they have three or four. So in that case, there won't be any time freed up for the parents, but you will get a benefit from that, from the enhanced sort of human capital investments in those children. The time could go to more market work. So this, if every decrease in the amount of time you needed to spend on kids, if instead of thinking like that the time benefits are going to come because it only takes me, say, 15 years to really invest in 2 kids versus 30 years to invest to provide the care for 6 kids, then that time gained might go directly into market work. Or it might go into it might go into non-market work. It might relieve some issues of time poverty. It might increase women's well-being, the well-being of parents. Any of those is a net gain. Policy around this kind of freed up time and care has to consider the institutions that support the gendered economy. So if as a policymaker, I am hoping to realize big gains from reduced time needs for childcare, I'm going to have to make sure that the policies are in place to allow women to enter the workforce, to allow them to make the most efficient use of their human capital, to realize as much of that benefit as possible. I'm going to have to make sure that my cultural institutions around appropriate behavior and work for women are not going to prevent that gain that I hope to realize. Okay. So what to do, and this is not, anything sort of demographically special, but I think that what projects like national time transfer accounts and counting women's work can do is to put forward more numeric policy evidence that is compelling to policymakers and other stakeholders to support things that we knew were a good idea anyway. And also to help sort of target investments across different areas where we can compare countries or times or regions within countries and figure out what are the biggest barriers and which ones to address first. So remove barriers to women's and girls' full economic participation and discrimination in wages, access to capital and labor market. There was just a big report out on, I think it was like the women in business, I can't remember what the institution is, but that it's something like 80 to 90 countries still have laws that specifically prevent women from participating in certain aspects of the economy. So owning land, having single ownership, having bank accounts in their own name, being able to inherit assets at the same ages as men, all sorts of things. And maybe these aren't followed so much, but that's a lot of the globe to still have specifically targeted gender financial exclusion laws on the books. So, and then address inequality in unpaid care and housework. And the 3 R's have been a long recognized sort of rubric for organizing the responses to inequality in unpaid care and housework. To recognize it, which is what Counting Women's Work is trying to do, and then reduce it. So through infrastructure investments, as we were discussing, or market substitutions that can do things more efficiently, and then redistribute unpaid care responsibilities that can't be reduced within households and share it more equally between men and women to maximize maximize return from all other development investments. So of course, as a data person, I want to end all the slides with the data gaps. So we really need more and better time use surveys. We want to harmonize them across time and place. There is a great diversity in the way time use surveys are done in different countries, and that makes it very hard, if not impossible, for us to do the comparative work we would like to do. Also, how to measure time of younger children is important because, as I was discussing before, the limited sources that we do have show that these kinds of unpaid care work gender gaps operate at very early ages. And then there's the need to measure elder care much more accurately. It is much more conceptually clean for people to answer a time use survey about the time they spend caring for their children compared to the time they spend caring for an elderly parent. You know, when I call my parents and talk to them, I would classify that as social time, but there is a degree of sort of monitoring that's going on. And certainly as my parents age, the mix of our communication that is just social time versus actual sort of care monitoring time is going to change. And then we're going to need to fill these data gaps because there is now an unpaid care work sustainable development goal to make this responsibility is more equitably divided between men and women. And those sustainable development goals need to be monitored with data. And then as our populations age, all of these things are going to become more important. So I think that's where I'm going to end. Thank you very much for listening to all my blabbing.
Just on time.
Mm-hmm.
Ya. Si tienen preguntas, Katy y yo les vamos a estar ayudando con el micrófono. Pueden hacerlas en español o inglés. But I just want to thank Gretchen because this kind of work, it's an international and comparative work, and it's not too easy to present all these results. And now, and also Gretchen is one of the leaders of this project, and is really, really important.
Thank you very much. Gretchen, it was very interesting. You gave me a lot of answers about my personal life. I adopted a child when I was 40 and was a single mother.
Mm.
So, and was academic.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you some questions because maybe there's another option in this distributing the parenthood. In Mexico, we're going to have elections soon, and one thing in discussion is what is the role of the state in all this. Once a cousin of mine visited me from Australia. My boy was 8 months old, and she demonstrated me that it was impossible to adopt a child as a single mother in Australia, the country with the highest income level in the world. And that was because of time, of working time.
Yeah.
And I always wonder why the lowest low fertility is in South Spain and South Italy, and you gave me the answer. I thank you very much. But what happens with Mexican women who want to be at home and want to have children? Why the state will not provide, the whole society will not provide these women with the conditions for being a mother and developing herself as a person?
Mm-hmm.
She could study, she could work, partially work, and could be at home with children too.
Yeah.
Why not? I am 70 now. I am from the time when some women wanted socialism, because we had a first world where everybody wants to be. We had a second world that were socialist countries who provided with guarderías, a las cunas, alimentación para los trabajadores, ¿no? And we had a third world that were us. That's my question.
Yeah.
And marriage, child marriage has to do with work, with labor. Mm-hmm. Marriage has to do with labor too.
And she is Yvonne Sass, one of our best professors, and she works about gender and migration.
Mm. Okay.
Sexuality. Sorry. I forget that. ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta?
Hi, Gretchen. I'll ask you for advice. And I think in your presentation, it became clear to me that the entity work and the CWW work is about making it women's work, or the invisible work visible. But in policy discussions and you touched briefly on this. And most policy discussions are nowadays driven by women not being as fully in the labor market as men. And even what I'd ask you is if you were to make a statement about CWW work in those terms, what would you say? I mean, you are showing that women make an important contribution to care work, but how much does that really prevent them from being in the labor market? And how important is it that they are not fully in the labor market in terms of productivity and gender equality?
Mm-hmm. Those are good questions. You want to take another question? Okay.
Sí, en español, pero buenos días. A mí me pareció muy, digamos, esclarecedor la presentación, porque nos muestra que efectivamente la desigualdad en temas de cuidado, digamos, atraviesa la relación de género en absolutamente, digamos, todos los contextos.
No. So what she said is it was really interesting what you were showing, because what your information showed is that gender divisions, that the inequality in unpaid care work goes beyond gender divisions.
Pero lo que, digamos, quiero como hacer énfasis es que efectivamente en América Latina o digamos, en países en desarrollo o en zonas específicas, los elementos culturales empiezan a tener un peso distinto en esta diferenciación, digamos, de las horas de cuidado. Y por ejemplo...
But in different regions of the world that are under development, I'm not a professional in translating.
Los elementos culturales.
That cultural institutions start to become very important in explaining the differences in unpaid care work that we see in different countries within the developing world.
Y además de eso, algunas investigaciones se han determinado que en contextos de migración forzada, como refugio o desplazamiento interno, estos roles cambian porque los hombres por lo general empiezan a tener más, digamos, horas de cuidado, porque se insertan mucho más difícil al mercado laboral y eso empieza a cambiar los roles de género, digamos, en estas relaciones. Again.
That's a really good comment. I want to make sure I translate it correctly. So what she said is that in contexts where we see forced migration, refugee situations, the gender division of unpaid care work starts to change also because men start to assume a lot more of that work because they have a harder time inserting themselves in the labor market.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's the comment. Mm-hmm.
If there are no more questions, I want to have the opportunity to make two. The first one is about in Mexico, we are talking about the competition between women and men. And because in order to increase the labor participation of women with a really complicated labor market, the competitivity between women and workers for the same job is getting worse in Mexico, and could be this one of the issues that affect the opportunity to achieve the gender dividend in terms of increase the labor participation. And the other one is that the role of inequality in the national transfer time account, because I know that this kind of methodology is under developing, and also Estela can tell how hard it is to measure and make all of these estimations for a single country, that it's Mexico, in the case of Estela, and how hard the NTA team is working to achieve this goal to make visible something that is invisible. Yeah, and for that reason, I want to know what do you think that could be the role of inequality in terms of understand the role of demographic change in this area?
Okay. All right. Thank you for all of the excellent questions. I hope that I can remember them all well enough to respond. So the role of the state in redistributing, as one of the pieces in redistributing some of the privately borne burdens of parenthood, is very important. Something that I'd like to ask people in panel discussions is that, okay, so all of a sudden you are the queen of the universe, what would you do? So if I ask myself that question, I would, and this is the US context that I'm most familiar with, but I would make public schools open all the time. Like, they would be open 24 hours. There would be constant childcare. There would be constant opportunities for older people to work in those as volunteers, as paid caregivers, if they're able to sort of, give a consistent enough time that it would sort of qualify as a paid job, and have the state be the sort of host for all of these, for a much broader way of exchanging time and resources instead of just within the household. Certainly in the United States context, some of the problems with all this is that we're trapped in our households. In time long ago, and in other contexts that I've lived, there's much more sort of household integration across, say, a big family group where households live together, or neighbors or villages. There's a lot more sort of interaction. So I would kind of use the state as the host for a location where much more of that exchange can happen. I think that now for women so I think that low fertility gives us an opportunity to make this case very strongly, that all of this unpaid care work, that societies have been getting free stuff from mothers for a very long time. And as low fertility has helped break down some of the institutions that kept mothers and not as anything else in society, I think we're seeing in low fertility contexts that mothers are saying, yeah, that's a bad deal. I don't want to give you free stuff anymore. And so you get one kid, you don't get two. And then you're going to have these sort of commensurate problems. So I think that that it's giving us an opportunity to recognize that social reproduction is not just social reproduction, like environmental services, is not just something that is going to happen when the sun rises. If we pollute the water, we can't have water anymore. If we don't make it possible for women to be full members of society, unless we force them to, they're not going to give us kids anymore. So I think that is an opportunity for the state to realize that it has to be more of the host, more of the bearer of the burden of social reproduction, so individual women can do both market work and homework, and also so that more women, if they wanted to, can stay at home and provide those services as well. There's lots of innovation around the world. I shouldn't say lots, there's some. So there are discussions in South Africa. Where is another? I know I'm blanking on the other country, but they're talking about rearranging their pension system so that you get credits for staying home and taking care of children in households. And that's important. In olden days, the idea was that you get your husband's pension credit, but your husband's probably going to die before you now. Your husband might have a long period. Yeah, that's always been true. Certainly. But, your husband could have a long period of illness. That's going to sort of deplete your, household funds. You might get divorced, and then you only get sort of 4% of the pension benefit as a widow or survivor or whatever that you would have otherwise. So recognizing that you actually need to cover with some sort of social protection scheme unpaid care work as well. So that's another way in which the state can make it possible for women to stay home and do that work, but without it coming with all of the commensurate economic disadvantages. So, and Estella, so I think your question was around the fact that the policy discussion seems to be so closely targeted on just women as like, they need to work more, they need to work more. Okay, certainly that is true. And this idea that, and there's a very common idea in people understanding population aging, that women are sort of an untapped workforce. You know, this is the next. So, but you look at those time schedules and there's nothing untapped about that. There's plenty of work already being done. So, and where the opportunity is to say to policymakers, you're not going to realize those goals. You actually will not be able to maintain your consumption by getting more women to work if you don't figure out a way to reduce this burden on them, either providing publicly provided childcare or having more, having social marketing campaigns to make this work visible and make it more possible for women to advocate for themselves within their own households and say, you know, you have to share this with me. Not just to their male partners, but also to their children themselves. The idea, I mean, there's sort of the common idea in Italy that like the son is the little prince, you know, and you have the mama who does everything, and you know, and so, and where do those ideas get you? In some ways, those ideas get you to 1.2 total fertility rate, you know. And then, so the issues of the fact that the gender dimension of the economy is not just something that is universal across our countries, but also has another dimension of inequality across countries is certainly something I think that our data helps us see. So the positive spin on that is that our data shows that there is nothing biological about this division of labor, that the women in Sweden are actually not a different species than women in Ghana, you know, or men in Sweden and men in Ghana, that over time they have gone back into the household. I mean, there's also a lot of interesting sort of sociology on the long spread of kind of the gender revolution and the household revolution. Olden times, we were all in households together, subsistence agriculture, everyone was producing everything in the household. Industrialization comes along, women stay in the household, their production stays in the household, men's production goes out. So in many places, we're seeing moves to bring that back, women, or to sort of explode that division back to everybody's doing everything. So that is potentially a sort of historical sweep that will continue and that will spread to countries in lockstep with women going more into the market and men also realizing that they can go back into the household too. So now the issue of unpaid care work and sort of and division of labor in refugee populations, I am not familiar with that research at all, so I can't really speak to that, but it is very fascinating to me and goes along with the idea that supports the idea that none of this is essential. There's no gender essentialism that can't move when conditions change. So those can, I think, contribute to a very positive message to tell men who are very reluctant or very worried about not being men that, you know, because they're taking care of their children or because they're cleaning or because they're sort of willing to share these burden more. And also, I should say, saying to women that it doesn't make you less of a mother if your husband is taking care of the kids. I mean, that's, you know, there's a difference, and not like first world problems big time, but I mean, my sister is a stay-at-home mom. My husband and I both work, but My husband works less than I do, and he takes care of the kids when I travel. He probably does more childcare than I do. And, you know, my sister was like, why did you have children if you didn't want to take care of them? So, yeah, I know. First world problems. My sister's annoying. But, you know, but there's a side for women as well. And not just first world problems, but this is also exists in dynamics in Middle East and North African countries as well, that women have very much internalized the message that their role in society, if you want to be part of society, it is as a mother. And that attitude sustains really high fertility when there's a lot of reasons to want to reduce that of the women themselves. But if the only way that you get to kind of be part of things is as a mother, then you have a really strong reason to keep childbearing, even if maybe you can't afford it, if you don't want to, if it's not good for your health. But there's still that big incentive that if I want to be part of the culture, that's the only option I have. So those things, I think the more that we can emphasize cross-country experiences can loosen the ideas that those things are really that important and hopefully undermine them a little bit. And then the issue of sort of the competition that more women work going into the labor force, if you're not at the same time diversifying the fields in which those women are going into, then you just get, in the United States, it's common to call it the pink collar ghetto, that women-dominated industries, in bad times, low-paid, female-dominated occupations, those wages go down. That is a problem, and I think that's an important argument to make for policymakers who want to increase female labor force participation, that if you do not at the same time focus on raising the overall average productivity of women in the workforce by diversifying across these occupations, that you will not realize the gains that you want. And then the issue of inequality. So with NTA, so we have these curves. It's a per capita, it's one line. And we know that while these lines differ at their per capita levels across country, they also differ tremendously in the dispersion around those lines. Now, the reason we always show per capita is because of the framework of plugging into national accounts. So I get some age distribution from my survey, and then how do I match it to national accounts? Well, I figure out one adjustment factor that goes to the whole age structure. So that turns it into an average. And so how could we get the distribution so we could just have that adjustment factor on sort of the 80-20 lines, 80 percentile, 20 percentile lines around that. And that would at least make it possible for us to compare across countries. You guys both have worked on the other efforts which is mainly NTA's kind of the thing that we can do cross-comparatively in the most straightforward, clean way, is to pull apart those lines by the average education of the adults in the household or the education of the household head. So then the problem we get into is cell size for all of these surveys that we need. So if I have a survey where I have 100 people in it who are 42, okay, now I want 50 of them are male, 50 of them are female, and then I'm gonna have 3 education categories for each of these, so then my cell sizes get really small. But, so the worry there is that our sort of signal to noise ratio goes way down. We less signal, more noise. But that hasn't stopped us before, so, at least you don't know how to fix those problems until you sort of go down the road and really see the magnitude of them. So that's the big effort to start including those in national transfer accounts. And then the other big effort too is to, instead of just having one snapshot for each country, is to have repeated snapshots over time so that we can see how the generational economy and the gender economy develops over time in our different countries. So I hope that got most of where we had gone before.
On one of your last slides, you mentioned that one of the, oh, okay, not the last one, maybe the next.
This one? Before.
Anyway, no. Keep going, one more. Anyway, to reduce barriers for girls and women to fully participate in economic markets.
Yeah.
So the other side of that is to reduce barriers for men and boys to further participate in unpaid care work. And so I was wondering if you have data or experiences that you could share with us of countries like Sweden or Denmark that have implemented policies that allow men to participate more in the unpaid care work, and how those graphs that you showed us change once the men actually are participating more in that.
So the best example of this that I know of is not a national transfer accounts research, but it is research done on Sweden and some other Nordic countries that so the parental leave is always the big family policy that everyone's talking about and trying to figure out how best to implement it. So you have a family policy with big paid leave, and that's great because it gives children and their parents a better start. But then what you see is that it makes women look riskier in labor markets. That I hire somebody for a few months, and even if I'm in a Nordic-style social welfare state where the costs of 3 years of paid leave are going to be diversified across the entire society, instead of some countries where the terrible ones we're starting in the US are very much the employers have insurance to pay for family leave policy in the couple states where it is. But even if I can sort of not have to pay the costs of that person, I'm going to be unlikely to hire a woman I'm going to be less likely to hire a woman if I think she's going to work for us for a year and then leave for 3 years. And she's just a worse bet compared to her husband. So what they did was to change it to the mother gets 1 year of leave, the father gets 1 year of leave, and then they have a year of leave they can split, or anybody can split. You don't get anything if you don't take it. So that's the carrot, so instead of the stick. And that did increase a lot of paternity leave. And the good thing about this, and the reason that it would be great if this just became the standard practice, was that paternity leave has a lot of benefits over the lifetime of the kids and the household. That there's something about getting the father into the household to have sole childcare responsibility of an infant that, and maybe it breaks down this idea that like men can't take care of children. So you kind of trial by fire, go in and have sole responsibility for your vulnerable infant all day, and you just kind of have to buck up and figure it out. So, but then even after that child is in school, even after the paid leave is all completely over, those fathers are spending a lot more time with their kids, and there's a lot less of a sort of tilt towards the household care work burden on mothers than there is on fathers. So that is certainly one bit of research that seems to be pretty conclusive as a net positive. There doesn't seem to be any big downside. If you're going to have your paid leave policy, which is good, you should give it to both mothers and fathers, because there are plenty of countries that any kind of post-birth leave is only for mothers. And when the United States actually, we don't have one, but when we at least inched up to talking about one, it was talked about as specifically for mothers. And certainly, right after the birth, there are plenty of biological reasons why that makes sense. But if you're talking about 2 years of leave, there's no biological reason that a father can't take care of a kid from age 1 to 2. So, so that's not an NTA thing. And then our ability to do that kind of thing is hampered only just by the time to finish the research. That for many countries, we only have one point in time where we have all of this age dimension. The network is working on repeated cross-sections, and I have that for the United States going back to the 80s. So if we do enact one tomorrow, I'm ready. I'll be able to keep track and see what happens. Yeah, and some other countries are working on that too. But at least, if we can maintain this going forward, because it seems like there will be more opportunities like this to then be able to understand, to be able to observe what if any of those policies change the needle, and if they do, which ones, how much, was it worth it, how much did it cost, all those things.
Okay. In order to finish, I just want to paraphrase something that you tell us. Then maybe could be a great goal. Then we can make women's and men's full members of the social reproduction society. Yeah, that try to change these kind of roles and make better our society in terms of be more equal. Yeah. Sorry.
I like that, the social reproduction society. That sounds like a good goal. Yeah.
And
I'll buy the T-shirt.
Okay, yeah, it's great. Thank you for this conference. I think we really enjoy it.